Brandon's hand froze in the air, just inches from my face. For a split second, I thought he might actually follow through. My own son. The same boy I used to lift on my shoulders at Little League games. Now a grown man, towering over me in the grease-stained office of our family's auto shop on East Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, ready to hit me over a disagreement about paperwork. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached down to the battered leather briefcase by my chair. Inside wasn't a wrench or a weapon. It was something sharper. Papers. Documents. Receipts. He didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just his father anymore. I was his reckoning. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Go ahead, I told him quietly. My voice didn't even shake. Raise your hand all you want, but I've already raised something stronger. The papers that end this. Brandon blinked, confused. That cocky fire in his eyes faltered. He thought he had the upper hand because he ran the shop day to day while I'd been semi-retired, doing bookkeeping from home. He thought I was weak, outdated, disposable. What he didn't know. For months, I'd been piecing together every reckless loan, every supplier invoice he'd ignored, every signature he'd forged in my name. I had proof. Legal proof. And tonight, when he pushed too far, I finally had the courage to use it. The air in that little office was thick with motor oil and betrayal. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a bad omen. Brandon's hand dropped, but his pride stayed up like a shield. He sneered, trying to recover. What papers? You think you know business better than me. I slid the manila envelope across the desk, the one that could gut him without me lifting a finger. His eyes scanned the first page, and I saw it, the exact moment he realized his empire was built on sand. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened. The same man who had just threatened me couldn't speak. And that's when I knew this story wasn't about him losing control in that office. It was about me finally taking it back. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. The sound of that moment, Brandon's breath catching when he saw those papers, still echoes in my mind. But the truth is, moments like that don't come out of nowhere. They build. They stack up like unpaid invoices on the corner of a cluttered desk, waiting until one day the weight tips over and crushes you. I used to tell myself keeping the peace was more important than speaking up. I thought swallowing my words was the same as protecting my family. After all, what kind of father calls out his son in front of neighbors? Or worse, admits his own child has crossed a line? In my mind, silence felt like love. But silence, I learned too late, is just fuel for someone else's fire. Mornings in Columbus usually start the same for me. The AC humming faintly, the smell of black coffee dripping into the pot, and the sound of traffic outside on East Main as folks head to work. I'd grab a glazed donut from Buckeye Donuts on High Street if I was up early enough. Life had a rhythm. Familiar, comfortable. And yet, even in that comfort, I'd notice small things that gnawed at me. An overdraft fee on my checking account even though I hadn't touched it. A letter from the state tax office with my name on it, though Brandon was supposed to be handling the business filings. I tucked them away in a folder, telling myself I'd bring it up later, when he was calmer, when the time was right. Funny thing about the right time. It never comes when you're waiting for someone else to hand it to you. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the light buzzing overhead, sorting through envelopes. My neighbor Maria, God bless her, knocked on the back door. She'd seen me pacing early in the yard. She had a knack for timing, showing up when I least expected it. She poured herself a glass of sweet tea, leaned on my counter, and asked a question nobody else dared. Frank, when are you going to stop letting that boy run you over? Her words stung, because deep down, I knew she was right. I'd been letting Brandon bulldoze me for years. He had this charm, the swagger that made people think he had it all figured out. He was good with customers, I'll give him that. Folks like his confidence. But confidence without accountability? That's a loaded gun with no safety. I told Maria I was just trying to keep things civil, that Brandon was stressed, that maybe if I gave him more time, he'd find his footing. She shook her head, sipping her tea like she'd heard this song too many times. Time doesn't fix arrogance, Frank. Accountability does. Those words stuck with me. Still, I clung to my old belief. I thought being the quiet accountant father was better than being the stern disciplinarian. I thought peace was safer than confrontation. But peace isn't peace when it comes at the price of your dignity. Looking back, I realized my misbelief wasn't just about Brandon. It was about me. I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed back, I'd lose him completely. That setting a boundary meant severing the bond. But here's the thing. When love becomes submission, it isn't love anymore. The folder on my table grew thicker every week. Receipts, invoices, bank notices. Each one felt like a paper cut that I pretended didn't sting. Until one day, the folder wasn't just paper anymore. It was my lifeline. But the truth didn't start that night in the office. It started months earlier. Months before Brandon ever raised his hand at me, life had already been unraveling thread by thread. Our family's auto shop, Dorsey & Son Automotive, had been on East Broad Street for nearly 30 years. Folks came from all over Franklin County because they trusted us. We weren't the cheapest, but people knew when Frank Dorsey fixed your brakes, you'd get home safe. When my wife, Linda, passed away 5 years ago, the shop became more than a business. It was my anchor, my reason to get out of bed. Brandon stepped in around that time, full of energy, talking about modernizing the place, running flashy ads on Facebook, and taking out loans to expand. I wanted to believe him. He was my son. After all, he had a vision. But visions without numbers are just mirages. And numbers were my world. One Tuesday in March, I was sitting at the counter with a regular, Mr. Daniels, who always brought his Chevy Silverado in for oil changes. He leaned close, lowering his voice. "Frank, you know your boy tried to upsell me a transmission flush I didn't need." I felt my stomach tighten. Brandon always had a salesman streak, but dishonesty? That wasn't how we built our reputation. I brushed it off, told Daniels maybe Brandon just misunderstood. But the doubt settled in, like rust on a muffler. Then came the money pressures. Brandon insisted on leasing a second property across town. Said it would double our profits. But the lease agreement. I remember holding it in my hands, noticing a clause about balloon payments buried in the fine print. I flagged it, but Brandon waved me off. "Dad, you worry too much. No one reads that lawyer junk. I've got this." I signed as co-owner anyway. Out of trust. Out of fear of losing him if I didn't. That document would come back like a ghost months later. Meanwhile, my personal life reflected the strain. I'd go to Kroger and find myself standing in the frozen foods aisle, staring at bags of peas, forgetting what I came for. Bills stacked up on the counter. Electricity, water, insurance. Prices were climbing everywhere. Gasoline in Columbus hit $3.89 a gallon that summer, and even with my accounting work on the side, I felt the pinch. Brandon, though, he'd roll up in a brand new Dodge Ram, Bluetooth blasting, telling me we needed to spend money to make money. It wasn't just money, though. It was respect. One Sunday afternoon, we were grilling burgers in the backyard. My neighbor Maria had come over with a potato salad. She watched as Brandon barked at me to flip the patties faster. "Come on, Dad. You're too slow. Nobody wants a burnt burger." Maria's eyebrows shot up. She didn't say anything then, but later she pulled me aside by the garden fence. "He talks to you like that often." I shrugged, embarrassed. "He's just under stress." She gave me a look that said she wasn't buying it. The second planted object came a few weeks later, a crumpled supplier invoice tucked under a pile of receipts. It was from an auto parts distributor, showing thousands owed, signed in my handwriting. Only, I hadn't signed it. My heart pounded as I held it up to the light. It was my name, my scrawl, but the date was a day I'd been in Cincinnati, at a CPA seminar. I checked my notes. I had proof. Someone had forged my signature. I didn't confront Brandon right away. Instead, I slid it into the growing folder at home. It joined the balloon payment lease and the overdue tax letter. Piece by piece, a puzzle was forming. And then came the day I'll never forget. It was late June, the Ohio humidity thick as soup. I drove out to the second shop, Brandon's so-called expansion project. The lot was empty, weeds pushing through the asphalt. Inside, the grand opening banners were half fallen, fluttering against dusty windows. No customers, no staff, just Brandon's laptop on a folding table. I walked through the echoing space and felt dread settle in my chest. That's when I realized this wasn't about ambition anymore. It was about denial. But I stayed quiet. I convinced myself it was my duty to let him try, even if he failed. A father supports his son, right? Even if it costs him everything. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. I remember the exact night the plan began to take shape. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the hum of the fridge the only sound in the house. The folder of documents lay in front of me, swollen with receipts, leases, and invoices. It had grown so heavy it was almost symbolic, like carrying the weight of Brandon's mistakes on my back. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, but not from fear. This time, it was from resolve. The breaking point had come earlier that week. Brandon had stormed into my house without knocking, tossed his truck keys on my counter, and demanded I co-sign yet another loan. He framed it as an opportunity. New lifts, better equipment, faster turnaround. I told him I couldn't. Not this time. His eyes went cold, his jaw tight. He muttered something about me being a burden, dead weight, holding him back. Then he walked out, slamming the door so hard a picture frame rattled off the wall. I sat in silence for a long time after that. And that's when it hit me. If I didn't draw the line now, there wouldn't be anything left. Not the shop, not my retirement, not even my dignity. Brandon wasn't going to stop. He drained me dry, all while telling me it was for the future. So I did what I knew best. I turned to the numbers. I pulled out the lease agreement from that second property and highlighted the balloon payment clause he'd ignored. I stacked the supplier invoices with the questionable signatures. I printed out bank statements showing overdraft fees and late penalties tied to his reckless spending. Piece by piece, I assembled what I started to think of as my shield. Not to attack him, but to protect myself. The timing mattered. July was approaching, which meant the annual business license renewal deadline for Franklin County. Without my signature, without my approval as co-owner, Brandon couldn't renew. That license was leverage, and he didn't even realize it. I booked an appointment at the county clerk's office. The woman behind the glass, her fingernails painted cherry red, looked through my documents and nodded slowly. If you can prove co-owner status and financial liability, you've got standing, she said. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but to me, it felt like a lifeline. She slid a packet across the counter. Form for a business ownership dispute filing. Filing fee, $87. Not a fortune, but it felt like the most powerful $87 I would ever spend. Maria, when I told her, raised her eyebrows. About time, Frank. You've been letting him run circles around you. You're not hurting him. You're saving what you built. Still, I hesitated. Filing meant going public. It meant admitting to the world, and a community that respected me, that my son had crossed lines I could no longer ignore. Pride is a funny thing. It can hold you hostage longer than fear. But late one night, I pictured Linda's face. I thought about the years we had poured into the shop, the reputation we'd built brick by brick, and I knew I couldn't let it all go to waste because I was too scared of confrontation. So I filled out the forms. I included copies of the forged invoice, the lease with my flag clause, and the overdue tax notice with my name stamped across it. I sealed the envelope, drove to the clerk's office first thing in the morning, and handed it over. The woman stamped it with a heavy thud, and just like that, the clock started ticking. The renewal deadline was only 3 weeks away. If Brandon didn't comply, didn't resolve the dispute, the business license would lapse. Without it, he couldn't legally operate. Every tire rotation, every oil change, every brake job would grind to a halt. That was my timer, my line in the sand. I didn't tell him right away. Instead, I watched. I waited. I let him swagger around the shop, bragging to customers about expansion plans, while I held the silent knowledge that the ground under his feet was about to crack. And then, as if on cue, the pushback came quicker than I expected. Brandon had always been brash, but when he caught wind that I'd filed something with the county, he didn't come at me directly. He went around me. One morning, I walked into the shop and saw his cousin, Kyle, the one who went to law school down in Cincinnati, leaning against the counter in a crisp gray suit. Kyle never stopped by unless it was Thanksgiving or Christmas. Seeing him there, smirking, told me everything. Uncle Frank, Kyle said, drawing out the words like he was enjoying the taste of them. You sure you want to drag family through paperwork? Courts don't look kindly on petty disputes. Petty, that word stung. Like protecting my life savings and reputation was nothing more than squabbling over who got the last drumstick at dinner. I kept my jaw tight, told him calmly that I had documentation. Proof. Kyle just smiled and tapped his briefcase. Documentation can be interpreted. That night, I felt the weight of it. What if Kyle was right? What if this all backfired, and I came off as a bitter old man who couldn't let go? I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and spread out my papers again. For every document I had, I could already hear Kyle spinning it. Forged invoice, a clerical error, balloon payment, a standard clause, overdrafts, business risk. The what IFS pressed heavy on my chest. And then, the first complication hit. My bank called. A $2,400 withdrawal had been made from a business account tied to my name. Money I hadn't touched. When I pressed, the manager told me Brandon had access because I'd left him co-signer privileges years ago. My stomach turned cold. Brandon wasn't just making reckless decisions. He was draining me dry, with my own permission stamped on the paperwork. Maria found me pacing in the backyard that night, the grass damp under my shoes. Frank, she said, putting a hand on my arm, you can't keep waiting for him to change. You've got the evidence. Use it. I wanted to. But then came the second complication. A letter from the state tax office arrived, red ink with urgency. It wasn't just that Brandon had missed quarterly payments. It was that my social security number was attached. If this went south, they wouldn't come after him first. They'd come after me. The pressure built like steam in a radiator, hissing and ready to blow. And just when I thought I had the upper hand, Brandon pulled his own stunt. I walked into the shop one Friday to find him holding court with a few of our longest-standing customers, laughing loud enough to fill the whole garage. When he spotted me, his grin sharpened. Dad thinks I don't know how to run this place, he told them, waving a hand like I was a pesky fly. But don't worry, folks. I've got everything under control. New equipment coming in, new contracts lined up. The customers nodded, chuckled politely, but I caught the flicker of doubt in their eyes. He wasn't just ignoring me. He was undermining me publicly. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, folder open, Maria across from me. I told her everything. The forged signature, the balloon clause, the tax notice, now the missing funds. She leaned back, folding her arms. So he's not just reckless. He's desperate, she said. And desperate people make mistakes. Her words sank in. She was right. Brandon's swagger wasn't confidence anymore. It was cover. That realization gave me a small spark of hope. Because if he was desperate, that meant he'd eventually slip up. And all I needed was one line, one slip, one overlooked detail to pull the rug out. That's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. The wrong problem. That phrase stuck with me like a song lyric you can't shake. Up until then, I thought the issue was Brandon's spending, his arrogance, his short fuse. But that wasn't the heart of it. The real problem was me. I'd given him the keys, not just to the business, but to my silence. Every time I looked the other way, every time I signed something without reading it, every time I told myself it's not worth the fight, I handed him another inch of rope. And now he was using that rope to hang us both. One muggy July afternoon, I was standing in line at the Starbucks on Main Street, waiting on a tall black coffee. The air conditioning blasted cold enough to sting my arms, but my thoughts were running hot. Ahead of me, two college kids were arguing about whether they should just follow the syllabus or do what feels right. It hit me then. Brandon wasn't the only one who had a choice. I did too. I stopped asking myself how to fix him. I started asking how to protect myself. That shift changed everything. That night, I gathered every document from my folder and stacked them neatly on the kitchen table. I pulled out the lease agreement, the forged invoice, the overdue tax letter, the bank withdrawal record. I made copies of everything and slid them into a separate binder. The original folder stayed with me, but the binder, I planned to deposit it with someone else. Insurance. I called Maria. She came over in her flip-flops, hair still wet from her evening shower, holding a notebook like she'd already guessed I was about to unload something heavy. "I need a second set of eyes," I told her. She flipped through the binder, her face tightening as she read. "Frank, this isn't just sloppy. This is fraud." Her words carried more weight than she realized. Fraud. That was a line I'd been afraid to name. Fraud meant accountability. Fraud meant consequences. Fraud meant I couldn't keep pretending this was just a father-son disagreement. I took a breath, my hands gripping the table. So what do I do? Maria tapped the binder. Stop asking for permission. Start following the rules. Every single one. That was the pivot. I wasn't going to beg Brandon to change. I wasn't going to yell, argue, or try to guilt him into responsibility. I was going to use the very system he ignored to hold him accountable. The first step was securing the business license renewal leverage. The county clerk had already told me the dispute filing would freeze renewal until it was resolved. But now I wanted more than a freeze. I wanted a paper trail so airtight that no amount of swagger or cousin lawyer spin could break through it. So I started building. Every day after work, I stopped by the county records office. I learned how to pull filings, contracts, liens. I found that the second property lease wasn't just bad. It was tied to an unpaid tax lien from a previous tenant. Brandon hadn't even checked. He'd signed blind. At home, I combed through bank statements with a highlighter, circling every withdrawal that wasn't mine. I dug out old emails from suppliers, cross-referencing invoices against their messages. And buried in my inbox, I found something that made my chest tighten. An email from a supplier dated the same day as that forged invoice. The supplier had written, "Thanks for your quick approval, Brandon. Glad we could get this through under your dad's name." That was it. Proof in writing. I printed it, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and tucked it in the binder. My hands trembled as I zipped it shut. For the first time in months, the fear in my chest eased. Not gone, but easing. The next Sunday, we had dinner at Maria's. She grilled chicken, poured lemonade, and invited her brother-in-law, who happened to work as a paralegal at a downtown law office. He flipped through the binder with a practiced eye. "Frank," he said slowly, "this isn't just leverage for a license dispute. If you wanted, you could file a full complaint. Civil fraud, small claims for damages, maybe even escalate further." I looked down at my plate, my fork untouched. I wasn't ready to think about courts or lawsuits. Not yet. But the idea planted itself in my mind like a seed. Brandon thought I was weak because I stayed quiet. What he didn't realize was that silence isn't weakness when it's deliberate. Silence can be strategy. So I stopped asking for permission and started following the rules, every single one. The first Monday of July, I walked into the Franklin County Clerk's office just as the doors opened. The air smelled of paper and floor wax, the kind of place where lives quietly change with a rubber stamp. I paid the $87 filing fee and submitted my binder of documents as exhibits. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, flipped through the binder, nodding slowly. Then she stamped it, received. That sound, the stamp hitting paper, was louder to me than any argument Brandon had ever won. It meant I wasn't just holding a folder in my kitchen anymore. I had a case number. I had standing. I had rules on my side. From there, I set about covering every base. I sent certified letters to the auto shop suppliers, informing them of the ownership dispute, and asking them to hold any new credit lines until it was resolved. That cost me about $75 in postage, but it created a trail. If Brandon tried to open more accounts in my name, there'd be evidence. Next, I met with the bank manager on East Main. I showed him the forged invoice and the suspicious withdrawal. His eyes narrowed. "Mr. Dorsey, this is serious. We'll need to freeze certain privileges until this is sorted out." That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I left, Brandon's easy access to draining our accounts had been cut off. I didn't stop there. I filed a complaint with the state tax office, enclosing copies of the overdue notices and my proof that I hadn't been managing the accounts during the missing payments. The clerk on the phone was blunt. "If what you're saying checks out, liability shift from you to the operating partner, your son." Hearing it in official language was like feeling the ground firm up under my shoes after months of sinking sand. But the hardest step wasn't paperwork. It was telling Brandon. I waited until Friday evening, when the shop was closed. I walked in with my binder under my arm, the scent of motor oil thick in the air. Brandon was at the counter, scrolling through his phone, his truck keys jangling on the desk. "Dad, what now?" he said, not even looking up. I set the binder down. "You're done making decisions behind my back. I filed a dispute. The county has it. The bank has it. The state has it. From now on, every number runs through me." He laughed. "That cocky sound that used to make me shrink. You think paperwork scares me? Kyle will chew this up and spit it out." I didn't rise to it. I just slid a certified mail receipt across the counter. "That's a postmark. The rules are already moving." For once, his smirk faltered. The next week, I spent hours at the clerk's office, at the bank, at my kitchen table. It wasn't glamorous work. I kept receipts in labeled folders, highlighted dates, created spreadsheets to track every fee and payment. It was tedious, exhausting, and strangely liberating. Every detail I nailed down was another brick in the wall between me and Brandon's chaos. By mid-July, I had built a fortress of evidence. Ownership filings, bank restrictions, tax complaints. Brandon couldn't make a move without running into paper with my name on it. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. For a while, it felt like I'd finally turned the tide. Brandon came into the shop one morning, fuming, when he found out the bank had frozen his access. His usual bravado slipped. "You think you can cut me out of my own business," he shouted. Customers waiting for oil changes turned their heads, the sound carrying through the garage. For the first time in years, I didn't shrink. I calmly told him, "I didn't cut you out. The bank did. Because you broke the rules." The look on his face was priceless, shock mixed with anger. And for a brief moment, I felt the taste of victory. But it didn't last. A week later, I got a letter in the mail, delivered by certified courier. Thick, heavy envelope. Inside was a notice. Brandon's lawyer cousin Kyle had filed a counterclaim. According to their documents, I was the one guilty of financial mismanagement and abandonment of responsibilities. They painted me as a doddering old man who couldn't keep up, who left everything on Brandon's shoulders, forcing him to act in good faith by signing on my behalf. Reading it, my chest burned. They weren't just offending Brandon. They were rewriting history, turning my silence into a weapon against me. And the worst part? On paper, it looked clean. Dates matched. Figures lined up. If you didn't know the backstory, you'd think I was a problem. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Maria, my head in my hands. What if they're right? What if I can't prove my side well enough? Maria put her hand over mine. "Frank, you've got the truth. Don't let his noise make you doubt it." But doubt seeped in anyway. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed of Linda, her voice telling me to hold steady. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the ceiling fan turning shadows across the room. The pressure mounted when customers started whispering. At the diner on Livingston Avenue, I overheard two men at the counter. Heard old Frank's losing his marbles. Brandon's running things now. The word stung worse than the counterclaim. My reputation was bleeding out in the very community I'd spent decades serving. Then came the lowest blow. The state tax office called. Brandon had responded to my complaint by submitting his own affidavit, claiming I had authorized him to manage all tax matters. Attached was a scanned document with my signature, my name, my scroll. Only, I had never signed it. When I asked for a copy, my blood ran cold. It was the same style of forgery as a supplier invoice, only more polished. If I couldn't disprove it, I'd be on the hook for thousands in back taxes. The walls of my kitchen seemed to close in that evening. Maria sat across from me, silent for once. Even she didn't have words. For the first time since I'd started filing, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have let things slide. Maybe keeping the peace would have been better than being dragged through the mud by my own flesh and blood. That night, I packed up the binder and shoved it into the closet. I poured myself a whiskey I hadn't touched in months, sat in the dark, and let the silence swallow me. I thought the fight was over, until one line in an old message changed everything. The old message didn't look like much at first. Just another email buried deep in my inbox from months back. I found it by accident one night while searching for a receipt. The subject line was bland, follow up on agreement. But the body of the email stopped me cold. Brandon, thanks for sending the draft. As you requested, I've left your father's signature line blank until you confirm he approves. We'll need his ink before we can process this officially. The timestamp was gold. It was dated 3 days before the supposed signed tax affidavit, the one Brandon submitted against me. In black and white, I had proof. The original form hadn't carried my signature. The supplier had been waiting for me to sign. But somehow, a signed version had magically appeared later. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the laptop screen lighting the kitchen. My heart pounded, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. Brandon hadn't just been careless. He'd been forging documents in my name. And here, tucked away in my inbox, was a breadcrumb that tied it all together. I printed the email and added it to the binder, slipping it right next to the signed affidavit. Together, they told a story clearer than any courtroom speech. The first email showed no signature. The second document suddenly had mine. Same date, same form, one blank, one forged. I didn't stop there. Fueled by the discovery, I combed back through months of messages. That's when I found more. A note from a supplier confirming that Brandon had asked him to process everything under Dad's accounts. A thread with a bank officer thanking Mr. Dorsey, though the reply address clearly came from Brandon's email. He'd been impersonating me electronically as well. Piece by piece, the puzzle fit. Brandon's motive wasn't just ambition. It was desperation. The flashy truck, the expansion project, the constant bravado, it was all smoke to hide the fire. He'd been drowning in debt. He hadn't just risked the shop. He'd leveraged my name to cover his own mess. That realization hit me like a freight train. He wasn't trying to build something bigger. He was trying to buy time before the whole house of cards collapsed. And he'd chosen me as his shield. I called Maria over that night. She read the emails, her face pale under the kitchen light. "Frank," she whispered, "this isn't just carelessness. This is fraud. And it's enough to sink him." Her brother-in-law, the paralegal, came by the next day. He flipped through the binder like he was handling gold. "This," he said, tapping the email printout, "is your smoking gun. It shows sequence, shows intent. Courts don't like intent." For the first time in weeks, I felt steady again. The noise of Kyle's counterclaims, the whispers in town, the sting of Brandon's insults, they all dimmed. Because now, I wasn't just defending myself. I had the truth on paper. The question was no longer if I could win. It was how far I wanted to take it. I stared at the binder long into the night, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. Did I want Brandon stripped of everything? Did I want him humiliated in court, his reputation shredded? Or did I simply want my name cleared and my future protected? It was Linda's picture on the mantel that gave me the answer. Her smile reminded me of who we were when we built the shop. Honest, hard-working, firm but fair. Revenge wasn't about burning him to the ground. It was about reclaiming what was mine and making sure he couldn't touch it again. Now I knew exactly where to stand. The morning I carried the binder back into the Franklin County Clerk's office, the sun was already burning hot against the sidewalk. July in Columbus had a way of making even a short walk feel like a test. But I felt lighter than I had in months. The binder wasn't just a collection of papers anymore. It was my shield, my sword, and my freedom rolled into one. I handed the clerk the new packet of evidence, including the email chain, the unsigned draft, and the forged affidavit. She looked over the pages, her red pen scratching notes. Then she gave me a look I'll never forget, half surprise, half satisfaction. "Mr. Dorsey," she said, "this isn't just a dispute anymore. This is fraud, clear as day." Those words echoed in my chest. Fraud. Spoken out loud, stamped into the official record. Brandon's arrogance, his forged signatures, his hidden debts. It wasn't just me seeing it anymore. It was a system. From there, the gears turned fast. The county scheduled a hearing on the business license renewal. Brandon showed up in his usual cocky way, wearing a slick sport coat like he was auditioning for a movie about businessmen. Kyle sat next to him, briefcase in hand, smirking like he had the whole room in his pocket. But when the clerk laid out the timeline, the blank form in the email followed by the signed affidavit submitted later, you could see Brandon's confidence crack. His leg bounced under the table. Kyle leaned over, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. The hearing officer asked me if I had anything else to add. My throat tightened, but my voice came out steady. I trusted my son with my name, my reputation, and my life's work. He used that trust to cover his debts. I won't stand for it. Silence filled the room. Even Brandon didn't have a comeback. By the end of the week, the ruling came down. Effective immediately, control of Dorsey and Son Automotive reverted solely to me. Brandon's name was removed from the license, and with the fraud evidence on file, the state tax liability shifted to him. The forged affidavit wasn't just invalid, it was now under review for potential criminal charges. Walking out of that office, binder in hand, the summer air felt different. Lighter, cleaner, like a storm had finally broken. But revenge didn't end in the clerk's office. I went to the bank next, binder under my arm, and requested Brandon's access be fully revoked. The manager didn't hesitate. With a fraud case on record, the accounts were locked to me alone. I walked out with new checkbooks in my name only, the way to financial freedom finally mine again. Then I drove to the shop. Brandon was there, leaning against the counter like he owned the place. His face fell when he saw me walk in with the official paperwork. "It's over, Brandon," I said, sliding the documents across the desk. "You're out. The license, the bank account, the tax records, they all point back to me now. You raise your hand at me. I raise the papers that ended your grip." For once, he didn't laugh. He didn't shout. He just stared at the pages, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. The customers who happened to be there watched in silence as he grabbed his truck keys and stormed out. The door slammed, the bell jangling above it. And just like that, the shop was mine again. I didn't gloat. I didn't chase him. I just stood there, breathing in the scent of motor oil and knowing that for the first time in years, it wasn't tainted with dread. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, binder finally closed. The fight wasn't about humiliation or revenge anymore. It was about survival, about reclaiming my name. And I'd done it without shouting, without fists, without breaking a single law. The adrenaline slowly drained, leaving calm resolve in its place. I had raised the papers that saved me. And now, whatever came next, I knew I could stand tall. Then came the calls. The first call came from the bank. The manager confirmed Brandon had tried to move money again, but the request bounced. "Mr. Dorsey," she said with an odd note of respect, "you're the sole account holder now. He can't touch a dime." The second call came from the state tax office. A woman with a crisp voice explained that the liability had been reassigned. Brandon would now receive notices directly. "You're cleared, Mr. Dorsey. Your file shows good faith," she said. For weeks I carried the fear of losing my retirement to debts I hadn't created. In one call, the weight lifted. Then came the harder fallout, the social kind. At the diner on Livingston, whispers circled. Folks who once praised Brandon's charm now muttered about his temper, his spending, the lies. A few even stopped me on the sidewalk outside the shop. "Frank," one man said, hand on my shoulder, "we didn't know. You should have spoken up sooner." That stung more than I expected, because he was right. Maybe if I'd raised my voice earlier, the damage wouldn't have spread so far. And then, out of nowhere, Brandon himself called. His voice was flat, stripped of the bravado I'd come to expect. "You didn't have to go that far, Dad," he muttered. "You could have just talked to me." I sat there holding the phone, staring out the kitchen window at the garden Linda once tended. My jaw clenched, but my voice stayed calm. "I did talk, Brandon. 4 years. You just didn't listen." The silence on the other end stretched long before he finally hung up. I knew better than to think that was the end. Brandon wasn't one to slink quietly into the night. Still, the balance of power had shifted. The shop was mine. My name was cleared, and the community was starting to see the truth for themselves. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. But as I leaned back in my chair, binder closed, one thought lingered at the back of my mind. And just when I thought it was settled, just when I thought the dust had settled, the wild card showed their hand. I was closing up the shop one evening, the sun dipping low over East Broad Street, when Maria walked in holding a manila envelope. She set it on the counter with that same no-nonsense look she'd worn the night she first told me to stand up for myself. "You need to see this," she said. Inside were copies of emails. Not from Brandon. From Kyle, his cousin, the so-called lawyer. Turned out, Maria's brother-in-law, the paralegal, had quietly been feeding her updates from the courthouse. He'd overheard Kyle bragging that he'd cleaned up some of Brandon's paperwork before submitting it. Smooth dates. Adjusted numbers. He thought he was clever. What he didn't realize, public records don't vanish. They just get copied. The email showed Kyle coaching Brandon on how to cover his tracks. If you shift the date on the affidavit, one message read, "It'll look consistent. Don't worry, your dad's too checked out to notice." My stomach turned, anger boiling. This wasn't just Brandon's recklessness anymore. It was calculated manipulation by someone who knew better. Maria crossed her arms. "You thought you were fighting your son alone. You weren't. Kyle's been pulling strings." The revelation cut deep. I'd spent weeks blaming myself for silence, for trust, for letting Brandon push me around. And now here was proof that another hand had been twisting the knife behind the scenes. I didn't shout. I didn't storm out. I just sat down at the counter, the scent of motor oil thick in the air, and let the truth sink in. If Brandon's arrogance had brought him to the edge, Kyle's interference had pushed him over. The next morning, I walked back into the county clerk's office, manila envelope in hand. I filed the emails as supplemental evidence. The clerk raised her eyebrows, flipping through the printouts. "Mr. Dorsey, this complicates things for the cousin too. He may face his own review." For a moment, I almost laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but a sharp exhale of relief. Because suddenly the picture was clear. Brandon hadn't been a mastermind. He'd been a pawn. A pawn too proud to admit he was in over his head, used by someone who should have known better. When I told Maria later, she shook her head. "So much for family loyalty," she said. The twist wasn't just that Brandon had forged my name. It was that he hadn't acted alone. And that meant my fight had never been about choosing between silence and confrontation with my son. It had been about shining a light on every shadow that had crept into our lives. What I learned wasn't about them. It was about me. Sitting alone in the shop after everything, I let the silence speak louder than the clatter of wrenches ever had. For years, I thought love meant swallowing my words. I thought being quiet was the same as being strong. But silence didn't protect me. It protected the people willing to use me. The real lesson? Boundaries aren't walls to keep family out. They're doors to keep dignity in. I'd spent decades teaching my son about hard work and honesty, yet I'd failed to model the one thing that mattered most, accountability. By refusing to draw the line, I taught him it was okay to cross it. But accountability works both ways. When I finally used the system, the contracts, the filings, the rules, I didn't just save myself. I forced Brandon to face the truth he'd been running from. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only way he could learn. I also learned that justice doesn't come from fists or shouting matches. It comes from the quiet strength of paper, proof, and persistence. Raising my hand in anger would have solved nothing. Raising those papers solved everything. If I could go back, I'd tell myself one thing. Speaking up doesn't ruin relationships. Avoiding the truth does. Now, whenever I hear Maria's words, time doesn't fix arrogance, Frank. Accountability does. I smile, because I know she was right. Here's a picture I want you to keep. Me, sitting at my kitchen table, folder closed at last, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. Same table, same chair, same old me. Only this time, I'm not carrying the weight of someone else's lies. I'm carrying the piece of my own truth. The kitchen looked the same as it had on those restless nights. The oak table, the hum of the fridge, the folder sitting in front of me. But something was different now. The folder wasn't swollen with dread anymore. It was shut. Finished. I sat back in my chair, the evening light spilling in through the blinds, warm and golden instead of harsh and sterile. The same spot where I once pored over forged signatures and overdue notices was now just a place for a cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle. It's funny how a room can feel different when you change inside it. Same table, same chair, Different man. Out the window, I saw Maria watering her garden, her laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. She waved when she spotted me, and I lifted my coffee mug in return. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by silence. I wasn't hiding behind paperwork, afraid of confrontation. I was free. Brandon? He hadn't spoken to me since that last call. And maybe he never would. That was his choice. What mattered was that I had made mine. I had drawn the line. I had raised the papers instead of lowering my head. Sometimes, revenge doesn't look like fire or fury. Sometimes it looks like peace, won through persistence and patience. My story isn't about destroying someone. It's about reclaiming myself. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next. And with that, I close the folder for good.